We are sitting down this morning with Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who is running for re-election in the 21st Congressional District of New York State. And we are doing this as, I think, our last interview of the candidates this year for this year's election on the state level and the federal level. And we're very happy to be sitting here with Congresswoman Stefanik. And it's Doug La Rocque, reporter for the Granville Sentinel, and me. I'm the editor, Jared Stamm, for NYVT Media. And thank you so much for being here with us.
Of course, excited to be here.
Yeah. So we just wanted to start off with, just tell us a little about yourself. I'd love you to talk about the 4 biggest problems facing America today. I'd also love for you to discuss what you think are your biggest accomplishments. Just to start there.
So I'm proud to be the only candidate who was born and raised in upstate New York. I grew up in a small business family, and New York is a challenging state to do business and run small businesses, whether it's a small newspaper or a small plywood distribution company. So I really learned hard work at a very young age, and also I had great educational opportunities that my parents' generation did not have. I was the first member of my immediate family to graduate from college. I served in the White House and came back home and started working at my family's business, and decided to run for Congress in 2014 with a focus on delivering results to our district, and I'm proud to be running on that record of results. In terms of the biggest issues facing both the country but also my constituents, overwhelmingly the number one issue that I hear no matter where I go in this district, whether it's Washington County or St. Lawrence County or the new parts of my district like Schoharie County and Montgomery County, is inflation. People are getting crushed by skyrocketing costs across the board, whether it's going to the grocery store. On top of that, you have increases in energy costs, and that's going to be particularly challenging going into this winter, where we are on pace to have home heating bills the highest they've been in well over a decade. Voters are smart, though. They know that it's a direct result of single-party Democrat rule and the trillions of dollars of spending that have been pushed out of taxpayer dollars that have caused this inflation. Another issue that I hear about both in the district but also nationally is this sense that our constitutional rights are being trampled, both from Albany and in Washington in the case of New York State. People are very concerned about Kathy Hochul's unconstitutional gun legislation that was forced through in response to the Supreme Court correctly ruling that the concealed carry limitations were unconstitutional in New York State. So people support the Second Amendment in this district, and that's in stark contrast to my opponent, who earned an F when it comes to standing up for Second Amendment rights. I've earned an A+. The third issue I would say is broadly safety and security, whether that's this crisis at our southern border and the need to secure the southern border, and that impacts our district in very specific ways because we have Border Patrol officers and CBP officers who have been transferred over and over again to our southern border. That's created no-notice deployments for their families, and we need to secure the border. When it comes to the state issues on safety and security, New York State is facing a crime crisis. If you look at the numbers across the state, homicides are up, violent crimes are up, and we now have a revolving door of returning criminals onto our streets because of failed bail reform and defund the police policies and rhetoric. So people are very concerned about Democrats' failed policies, anti-police policies, and that's why it's really important in this race that I've earned the endorsement from every state law enforcement union because they know I stand strongly in support of the blue, but also we're working to deliver additional federal grants for school resource officers, for county sheriff's office, for local police departments. In terms of my biggest accomplishments, I would say that constituent services we excel at as an office, whether it's working with the Whitehall School District to access $3.7 million of USDA funding after the horrific flooding that impacted the school. That was a phone call I had with the superintendent and responded immediately. But that's also over $5 million of veterans benefits, and those are individual vets or their families who have reached out to our office. I would say second, the work that I've done for Fort Drum, which is the largest single site employer in New York State and this district. Not only having President Trump at Fort Drum to sign our national defense bill, which included a historic pay raise for our men and women in uniform, but also rebuilding the military, making sure they have the training and equipment that they deserve and that the taxpayers want to invest in. And then I would say third, standing up for small businesses, farms, and manufacturers. Those are the backbone of our economy in this part of New York State, and I've been a very strong leader on agricultural issues, on small business issues. I've been rated as the #1 top Republican when it comes to small business issues, and that's by the Center for Effective Policy Making. So I'm running on my record of my results, and if you look at past elections, it has been resounding because people know that I work to deliver results for this district.
Thank you.
You were speaking about crime, New York State's cashless bail and its failures. Crime's up across the country, broadly, not just in New York State. All you gotta do is watch the national news to see that. What can we do as both a nation, as a state, to try and bring this under control?
Mm-hmm. It is a crisis across the country. You are correct. It's not just the NYPD who saw their budget slashed as part of the defund the police movement, but other cities like Seattle and Portland and parts of the Midwest as well. I believe that 2020, when there was the effort on the left, which continues today, to defund the police, to demonize law enforcement officers, that had real consequences on the rule of law in our country. And we have a president of the United States, when it comes to our southern border, who is not abiding by the rule of law and is allowing the most unsecure border in our nation's history, prioritizing illegals over our Border Patrol officers and communities, not only just along the southern border, but across this country. So what can we specifically do? I support the full repeal of failed bail reform in New York State. Judges no longer have the ability to make determinations based upon dangerousness, so you have this revolving door of criminals who have committed, in some cases in New York, hundreds and hundreds of crimes. You can't open the paper every day without seeing some horrific crime being committed, and it's not just New York City, it's cities like Albany, Troy, Rochester as well, and that impacts it impacts every police department in terms of the impact on the mental health for our police officers as they're demonized. It impacts our recruitment and retention. So we've got to get this country, and House Republicans are leading on this, to strongly support and work with our law enforcement officers who are on the front lines every single day. In addition, those increased resources that I talked about for school resource officers, which are widely supported in this district. I visited with school resource officers in our school districts, and it was Republicans that provided that increased funding for school resource officers. Federal grant dollars for those local police departments who are facing a crunch or facing cuts proposed by Democrats, and additional resources for county sheriff's office, which are so important in rural counties like in New York's 21st congressional district. Our county sheriffs are incredibly, incredibly important. And then it comes to, making sure that our district attorneys actually follow the law and prosecute the law rather than prioritizing the criminals over law-abiding citizens. This is becoming a big issue in New York State, most notably with Alvin Bragg, who Lee Zeldin correctly has said he's going to fire on day one. I think Lee Zeldin is going to win, and I support that decision. And it's why you saw voters in California recall some of the very radical left DAs. So the problem in New York specifically is Democrats in Albany did not bring in law enforcement to provide input as part of their policy-making process, which is typical of what we've been seeing from supermajority of Democrats. But there's a lot more that we must do to support law enforcement officers. And then the fentanyl, the drug overdose issue, is directly tied to the wide open southern border. I have worked very hard and delivered bipartisan results when it comes to comprehensive addiction and recovery funding and getting at the addiction crisis, but the fentanyl is the leading cause of death for adults aged 18 to 45, and it's increasing in terms of overdoses in the counties in this district. I've met with Washington County Sheriff, which we're in Washington County right now, and he has sounded the alarm on this issue. So making sure that we continue to address awareness among parents as the potential threat, but we've got to secure that southern border.
Okay. So back to the economy. It's, as you said, correctly identified, as of utmost concern to everybody right now. Inflation is at a 40-year high. shelves are still bare because of supply chain issues. Construction material prices are coming down, but who knows with all this. What does the country have to do to fix this? And I guess a follow-up would be to, are there other issues regarding the economy that are particular to the 21st Congressional District?
Absolutely. So on the inflation issue specifically, number one, you have to block the reckless $1 trillion spending bills and bring the appropriations process back to fiscal responsibility and bring a budget back towards balance. Since I've been in Congress, House Democrats have never put a budget on the floor that not only doesn't balance in 20 years, it never balances in perpetuity. I support bringing back fiscal responsibility towards a balanced budget. And when you saw $9 trillion go out the door with one-party rule in Washington, that has fueled this inflation crisis. And economists on both sides of the aisle, both liberal-leaning economists and conservative economists, both say that the inflationary impact was severe. And of course, the people that are paying the price are hardworking families. I mean, it's essentially a tax on every family in this district and across the country. When it comes to the energy piece, which is also a driving factor because costs of everything are up, including energy costs, and that impacts our farms, manufacturers, small businesses, family budgets. Joe Biden declared war on day one against American energy independence, whether it was cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline, whether it was red lighting and stopping new permits and leasing when it comes to new projects. And Republicans already have a slate of bills that we've introduced to unleash American energy independence and stop the reliance upon Russian energy, in the case that Joe Biden has literally prioritized Russian energy rather than domestic production. We have the natural resources, and by the way, ours are cleaner in terms of our production because our technology is better. And not only will that be an economic booster and create jobs, but that's going to immediately lower the cost of energy. We know what was working just over 2 years ago when we had a very effective president who ensured that we were energy independent. The other issue you asked about inflation. Oh, and then local issues. So one that's really important to our local economy that I've been active on is northern border. There's a lot of focus at the national level, rightfully so, on the southern border crisis. But the northern border, we have a different set of issues on the northern border. It's so important to our trade, our commerce, and just our day-to-day life, our tourism. We have communities where people go grocery shopping on other sides of the border. They own property on other sides of the border. And the prolonged closure of our northern border and the failure of Joe Biden to listen to our communities was just an absolute disaster. And I was proud to be one of the leading voices and one of the most effective voices in not only reopening the northern border, but lifting of mandates. Most recently, Canada's decision to lift the Arrive Can app, which was required for those cross-border northern travelers. That's based upon work that I've done with the Canadian ambassador to the U.S., with whom I have frequent phone calls, and other Canadian counterparts, as well as the work that I've done as co-chair of the Northern Border Caucus. We need to make sure that we continue to promote our partnership with Canadians. It's just a part of who we are in the North Country. But that's a very specific local economic issue that's important. Also, I would say, is agriculture. Agriculture is the backbone of our local economy. Here in Washington County, it's particularly important. And the anti-farm policies that we're seeing coming out of Albany, specifically like the overtime rule, limiting that to 40 hours, lowering that threshold, that's very punitive and dangerous to our farms, in the sense that our farms are not going to be able to continue to exist and thrive. Farm laborers are going to Vermont or Pennsylvania, where they're able to work more hours. The laborers are opposed to the Albany rule, and farmers overwhelmingly are opposed to it. I helped lead the effort in opposition to that, and unfortunately Kathy Hochul didn't listen. I introduced, or am one of the leaders on the Save Our Local Farms Act, and that would make sure that farms are able to continue to do the work when it comes to milking the cows, picking the crops, which don't work on a 40-hour work week.
Mm-hmm. Right. This is, I'm going to ask the next question. So this is, of course, a lightning rod issue in the country right now, the repealing of Roe versus Wade, which was, it's made abortion, in particular women's reproductive health rights and rights of a lot of other groups, sort of a hot button issue. We assumed for 50 years that it was settled law. And both of the Republican candidates we interviewed said New York State doesn't have to worry, it's settled law, but what are your feelings about this?
I'm pro-life with exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. I'm a new mom myself, and
Yeah.
I believe in the culture of life, and I've been a strong advocate for increased funding for pregnancy crisis centers as well as for maternal health, which I believe is incredibly important. I've also supported babies' health needs when it comes to the baby formula shortage. My opponent is in stark contrast, and Democrats have a radical position. They support taxpayer-funded abortion up until and after the moment of birth, late-term abortion paid for by the taxpayers. That's not where the majority of people are in New York State or in this country. I support the Hyde Amendment, which provides protections, and it's historically gotten bipartisan support to make sure taxpayer dollars don't go towards funding abortion. My opponent wants to repeal the Hyde Amendment. That is shredding decades and decades of precedents legislatively to ensure that taxpayer dollars don't go towards funding abortion.
You recently co-sponsored the Protecting Pain-Capable Unborn Children from Late-Term Abortions Act, which would in effect ban abortion after the 15th week nationwide. So taking a Supreme Court issue and returning it back to the states, now there's something on the, what is it? Is it do states have the rights to regulate reproductive health issues for their citizens, or does the federal government step in? Just what's your feeling on that? You co-sponsored this bill?
Yes.
Yeah.
So 15-week isn't a full national ban. It's 15-week with exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. That's a federal minimum when it comes to protections of life, and then states can choose to, if they would like to go further, states can make that decision. New York State has some of the most radical abortion policies in the country, putting us on par in New York State when it comes to abortion issues with China and North Korea. That 15-week standard would bring us more in line with European countries when it comes to protecting life, but also having those exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother.
Okay. And if the Republican Party is to regain control of both houses of Congress, one or both houses, and win back the presidency in 2 years, do you see this bill becoming law?
I believe there's a lot of discussion going on among House Republicans, and there's multiple pro-life bills that have been introduced, and that's a discussion that House Republicans will have when we're in the majority. That's the bill that I support, is the 15 weeks with exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. Mm-hmm. And I support protecting the Hyde Amendment, which we worked very hard to ensure taxpayer dollars don't go towards funding abortions in the U.S. or funding abortions around the world, which is what Democrats support. That would be the repeal of the Hyde Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
Talking healthcare, excuse me. Several years ago, when President Obama was in office, Obamacare became a reality, a step toward universal one-payer healthcare, as is sometimes seen in Europe and to a smaller degree in Canada. Your feelings on a universal healthcare system for the country?
I don't support single-payer healthcare. I've seen in this district when you have a single-payer government-run program like the VA, I mean, the number one casework we get every single week is from veterans who are absolutely frustrated with the VA bureaucracy, with the VA wait times, and in some cases, the access and quality of care. What I've focused on when it comes to healthcare is lowering costs, which when Obamacare was put into place, the promise that President Obama made was it was going to bring down costs. It hasn't. Costs have continued to increase, and specifically the high deductible plans are very, very challenging on top of inflation right now for families who they have quote-unquote coverage, but that high deductible, oftentimes they don't seek the care because they're not able to afford it out of pocket. So lowering costs, increasing quality and access, particularly in rural communities. What I've done is focusing on supporting our federally qualified health centers. I was given a national award for being one of the top advocates for those federally qualified health centers, so Hudson Headwaters, for example, which is so important to this region of the district, and also supporting our rural hospitals. I delivered over $100 million of funding for our rural hospitals, many of whom were not eligible because of regulations or how the rules were written, and we were able to work with the Department of Health and Human Services to make sure they got that funding specific to Glens Falls Hospital, and they're very grateful, and it's important for the community to have that access. When it comes to prescription drug prices, I am a co-sponsor of the Lower Cost, More Cures legislation, which is very bipartisan. I also think that any savings when it comes to prescription drugs have to be passed along to the actual patient, and that savings shouldn't just be eaten up by the insurance companies. And I have worked to support the 340B program, which is important, again, locally for hospitals and health centers, because it allows them to have lower prices for those prescription drugs, which in turn helps the patient. I also want to see small businesses able to pool together in associated healthcare plans, so that they can work to purchase the healthcare plans and increase their buying power. And I want to see healthcare plans to be able to purchase across state lines, particularly our proximity to Vermont, and that would benefit in terms of lowering the cost because it benefits the overall marketplace.
One thing that has been broached is because of the pandemic and many other reasons, people have faced layoffs or closures, and that has meant the loss of their health insurance in many cases. Should there be some sort of a federal safety net for these people that may not qualify fully for Medicaid, but still can't afford the high cost of individual medical insurance? Do we need some sort of a safety net for this group of people?
Well, I think you need to lower the costs. I mean, clearly the costs of healthcare are way, way too high, whether it's small businesses who are shopping on the marketplace for healthcare insurance for their employees, or whether it's the individual marketplace. One of the negative impacts of Obamacare is it also lowered the number, honestly, of choices of healthcare insurance coverage. There are many counties across this country who only have one choice when they go on the Obamacare exchange. That is not going to help when it comes to the cost issue. So again, when I talked about lowering cost, which will help those individuals to have more affordable choices, it means allowing healthcare options across state lines. It means allowing more innovation in the healthcare space to make those purchases for that coverage.
One other follow-up on it. Cost of drugs, and a number of people looking to get their drugs out of Canada, drugs by prescription, legal drugs I'm talking about. Should we be working to purchase some of this stuff from Canada where it's much lower priced in many cases?
I think we need to pass the Lower Costs, More Cures Act, and what Democrats have put on the floor would be price controls, and they also would limit the FDA when it comes to approving life-saving drugs. So you still want to have innovation when it comes to life-saving drugs. I mean, I meet with advocates all the time from this district who are suffering from very rare diseases or very rare and challenging forms of cancer, and they rely on those life-saving drugs. So you have to improve the FDA process and not have a heavy hand of government that would limit those life-saving drugs. But when it comes to the lowering costs, we want good bipartisan legislation on the House floor to overall lower costs and to give that savings to the patients. Canada is not the correct model. I believe that there is a reason why people around the world look to the United States when it comes to our healthcare system, both access but also cutting edge treatments, life-saving treatments, whereas they have to wait in a line in other countries and are on a waiting list and don't get that cutting edge care. So I support the bipartisan bills and the package that we've put forth as Republicans working with Democrats. Unfortunately, Pelosi didn't bring it to the floor.
I have more questions about healthcare in general. My dad is a retired doctor, and he went the evolution of healthcare from the administrator of the hospital deciding what a hospital room would cost based on the rate of the most expensive hotel in town, that kind of thing, and going up from there. What do you think the role is of health insurance companies in this problem of just this bloated cost system? of healthcare?
There needs to be more price transparency. So lots of constituents, and I think every family has dealt with some type of health crisis where you can't get a straight answer about what the cost is going to be for a healthcare procedure. And some of these procedures are really straightforward, and they should be able to tell you, here is, what the transparent cost is going to be. There's a lot that we can do to improve that price transparency piece, and I think insurance companies have to be willing to face significant reforms, again, when it comes to savings for the patients, but also overall transparency and a better understanding of, the very fine print often of these healthcare insurance plans, where there needs to be just much more understanding for the patient, and the insurance companies need to be very forthcoming.
Okay. Ukrainian-Russian war. How would you rate the U.S.'s response, and what else, more or less, should we be doing as a country?
I think Joe Biden, this is one of his biggest failures as commander-in-chief, and I was one of the Republicans who spoke out in support of defensive aid to Ukraine as a form of deterrence before any potential invasion. Remember, there were weeks and even months, if I recall, where this was in the news, and there was an understanding that Putin was going to likely invade. And what did Joe Biden do? He sat on his hands.
I thought Biden
He
actually
did not.
was
He did not support the bills that we introduced and wanted to see passed to provide that defensive lethal aid. The problem was, after the invasion, as the administration and the Department of Defense tried to get that aid in terms of weapons, munitions, it was a huge disaster for the first weeks of the war. So it was a very ineffective form of deterrence. I did support that aid. I think we do need, ultimately when it came for a vote in Congress, I think it should have happened much, much earlier as a form of deterrence. I think we do need much more stronger oversight in the form of an inspector general of the billions of dollars that have gone towards this. I do not support U.S. troops on the ground, and I think that our NATO allies need to step up and increase their contribution when it comes to supporting Ukraine's effort. And I also think broadly, if you take a step back, Putin understands weakness and he understands strength. Under President Trump, Putin understood that President Trump was a very strong president, a very strong commander-in-chief, who made significant investments in our military readiness, including when he signed the National Defense Bill in this district. Joe Biden has exerted weakness around the world, and Putin watched the catastrophic withdrawal of Afghanistan. He watched the fact that Joe Biden hesitated when it came to standing with our ally Israel when Israel was under attack in the first few months of the administration by rockets. And I believe Putin, one of the reasons that Putin invaded was because we have a weak commander-in-chief. And I believe that China is also watching very closely. And this is a consequence of weakness asserted by a weak United States president around the world.
We talked about energy briefly, and I think you covered most of this, but the Ukrainian crisis has created a drawdown in our ability to supply some of the oil and other energy without using our own. How do we get around that? Is it just totally go back to our own production?
I support American energy production, and Joe Biden wants to point fingers and blame everything on the war in Ukraine, but the reality is energy prices were already increasing before Putin invaded Ukraine. Inflation was already ticking upwards before Putin invaded Ukraine, and the American people are smart, and people in this district are very smart, and they know that while Democrats want to pass the buck, the reality is it's a result of the policies. I do support American energy production. As I said, it's cleaner because we have better technologies here, and we should never be relying on adversaries like Russia when it comes to our energy. And the fact that Joe Biden is having to beg adversaries for energy, it's inexcusable. And in the first month, when Republicans earn back the House, we will put legislation on the floor to unleash American energy production.
We spoke about President Biden. I think this is probably a pretty obvious question, but what do you think of his performance to date?
I think he's done a very poor job, and you see that in his lack of approval, not just from Republicans, but overwhelmingly from Democrats and independents. When it comes to the economy, this is the highest rate of inflation in my lifetime. You have multiple generations of Americans who have never experienced this type of economic uncertainty and economic weakness. You have, again, those gas prices and energy prices. We are headed towards a very challenging winter when it comes to family budgets in this district. Seniors who are either have saved for retirement or are close to retiring are seeing their savings wiped away by this weak economy. So I think Joe Biden has earned an F when it comes to his job. The other thing, as President of the United States, he gave his inaugural address and he talked about bringing this country together. And yet starting the next day, the first full day of his presidency, he has only worked with the far left and has sought to divide, including just in the past few months, delivering a national address, smearing tens of millions of Americans, further creating this divide. And I've been in office, I've worked with Democrat presidents like President Obama, I've worked with Republican presidents like President Trump, but the division that this administration led by Joe Biden has created is significant, severe, and it's one of the reasons why they're headed towards a huge political wipeout, because Republicans, I believe, are going to not only win back a historic majority in the House, but a majority in the Senate.
I'm going to follow up on that, jumping from another question. 40 years of reporting. This time around is the most divisive I've ever seen between Republicans and Democrats. There always was some common ground. It seems like that ground is gone. There's just very little agreement on anything. How do we get away from that? How do we get back to both parties placing the country first versus politics?
Well, these issues, people are upset about these crises that the current single-party Democrat rule has created in Washington. And, I have a record of delivering bipartisan results, whether it's the Farm Bill or whether it's being the top 25% most bipartisan members of Congress. And President Trump delivered a lot of bipartisan results. The trade agreement, USMCA, which was historic, the work that he did in terms of combating the opioid epidemic, rebuilding our nation's military. We pass a bipartisan national defense bill. I've been one of the leaders on that every year in Congress. So there's a lot of bipartisan opportunities, but I will tell you, serving in this Congress, we have been blocked out from even the committee process working by Speaker Pelosi. Constituents, when they visit their members of Congress, have to send their name to Speaker Pelosi's office for approval. That's never happened before in the history of the Capitol. So they have created a very divisive environment. And I will also say the national mainstream media, and I'm not including the great local reporting of this paper, has focused on fueling that divide to get clicks and garner headlines. And, personally, this district knows, and my constituent knows, that no other House Republican has been smeared more viciously than I have. When I stood up for the Constitution and stood up for my constituents during the impeachment proceedings, it is a level of viciousness that is just unacceptable today. And, I think I can tell you what Republicans are going to do is restore the People's House, make sure that we have an amendment process so that members can introduce amendments, and make sure that we have committees that actually work to bring legislation to the floor. A lot of the bills I also talked about have bipartisan support, like the lowering the cost of drugs through the Lower Cost More Cures Act. We intend to pass those bills and return Congress to a more functional institution.
Okay, I'll go next.
Yep.
So, 21st District's gone through a bunch of geographic changes with redistricting. Some of the some say that enrollment and the voting record, particularly with the addition of rural Rensselaer, Schoharie counties, it's become slightly more red. Does this help your reelection effort, or do the additions of sections that were once part of Delgado's district show enrollment doesn't really matter? Like, what do you think?
Well, first of all, let's take a step back about why the redistricting process was so challenging in New York State. And it's because Albany Democrats had a supermajority and they got greedy and they overreached to try to protect themselves and suppress the vote of specifically upstate New York and specifically Republicans. They tried to carve all Republicans into just 3 congressional seats rather than having fair lines. That's why at every level of the court challenges, their lines were thrown out as unconstitutional and illegal. So we have fair lines because of the people of New York, and despite the greedy, egregious, unconstitutional Albany Democrats' cesspool of corruption, which New Yorkers know all too well now. So shame on those policymakers for trying to protect themselves. So the district, in terms of, it shifts from 12 full or partial counties to 15 full or partial counties, so it got geographically bigger. A lot of the issues are very similar in terms of rural by nature, agricultural, small businesses. I'm very familiar with all of the districts since I'm the only candidate who was born and raised in upstate New York. You know, I meet new constituents every day in new counties in the district who I've known, and we anticipate a lot of support. In terms of our record electorally in this district, remember this was a district that was barely won by a point or two prior to me running. I've been proud to put up the largest margins in modern history in this district, including the largest number of votes ever last election cycle. And that's not just from Republicans, that's winning independents and a fair share of Democrats who support our ability to give this district a seat at the highest levels, but also delivering results. So electorally, I mean, the facts are this district voted more for Republicans at the presidential and congressional level as currently drawn than it did in previous elections. So I anticipate we're going to work really hard to earn an even bigger margin this cycle.
You've spoken already about your beliefs on the red wave. Using that term has become a buzzword. And that you strongly believe Republicans will take control of not only the House but the Senate. If that happens, will there be gridlock for 2 years?
I think that's up to Joe Biden. If Joe Biden is willing to work with a Republican House and a Republican Senate, first of all, he should work with us because the American people are going to speak loudly and clearly that they don't like the direction this country is going. And voters are going to see that pretty quickly firsthand if he's willing to work with us or not. We're going to pass good legislation that we send to the president's desk, and he can choose to veto or to sign it. But he has a lot of work to do. The American people have lost faith in the president, and it's why, as you see the reporting every day, his numbers continue to be at a very low approval rating, including even lower in this district because people are fed up with all the crises that have been created. Again, I've worked with Republican president, with Democrat presidents, and I know how to get things done and deliver for this district, whether it's funding, whether it's legislative results, whether it's my work on the Armed Services Committee. I know how to get things done, you know, no matter what the makeup is. But I think similar to 2016, where the media had it very wrong, similar to 2010, which was a big Republican year, where the media said, you know, this might not be as big of a Republican year. I think there are going to be some surprises from the media nationally on election night and from the folks in New York when it comes to how clear it's going to be that voters are tired of the status quo that single-party Democrat rule has given us.
Is that your gut feeling, or are there internal Republican polls that indicate different numbers than what the media might be putting out?
Well, I see polling from all the targeted districts across the country, and I will tell you that the media loves to sometimes bury the lead, but the reality is in these targeted districts, when it comes to the generic ballot, so Republican or Democrat, Republicans are winning overwhelmingly by upwards of 20 points. These are in districts that Biden carried by, in some cases, 15 points. The fact that we are in play in those districts shows this is going to be a huge, huge year. And I think we win the top Senate races that are in the news right now. I think we sweep them all.
Another question. Earlier in your career, you were seen as a much more sort of moderate Republican, and then I think the perception is that you've moved further right, even into like Make America Great kind of territory. Why do you think Donald Trump's so essential to the Republican Party? And if he runs again, would you support his candidacy, or is there someone else you would support?
I strongly support Donald Trump, and I hope he runs again, and I think he will run again. I also care deeply about the Make America Great movement, and I am concerned that so many Americans are in opposition to making America great. It is a unifying message in terms of supporting people who have felt forgotten or felt left behind, small businesses, manufacturers, farms that have been too often ignored by Washington. And it has concerned me that today's Democrat Party has really become so radicalized and not just anti-Trump, but anti the American people who support Trump and the Make America Great Again movement. He's expanded the party in this district. No district tells that story better than this district, that voted for Obama twice and then overwhelmingly shifted to vote for President Trump every time he's been on the ballot, including, when I ran in the midterms in 2018, when lots of seats flipped Democrat in parts of upstate New York, we won by the largest margin in the Northeast, and many viewed that as a referendum on President Trump. So we've won any time Trump's been on the ballot in this district, and he's more popular today in this district than he was even a year ago. You drive around this district, you don't see Joe Biden positive signs. You see President Trump positive signs, and you don't see any Kathy Hochul positive signs either anywhere in this district.
I guess it's sort of a philosophical question then. Do you think it's a good idea for a party to rally around one personality rather than a set of ideals? And it also seems to me that President Trump is so compromised in so many ways, and I just feel like wouldn't it behoove the Republican Party to rally behind somebody with fewer, less baggage, but the same principles?
I think you're letting your personal opinions sway how you're asking this question.
Okay.
The reality is President Trump is more popular today than he was a year ago, and if the election between Joe Biden and Trump were held today, President Trump would win walking away, no question. And the results he was able to deliver, whether it was standing up for farmers, whether it was the historic trade agreement, USMCA, rebuilding our nation's military, whether it was asserting strength around the world, which caused our adversaries to fear us, or whether it was, standing up for small businesses and manufacturers, or reducing regulations to help them. Those were significant achievements, and people remember that. People remember that, and they don't like the economy they have today. They don't like the open border that Joe Biden's policies have created. So do I think he runs again? I think he does, and I think he wins. And I think once again he's going to shock the media, who tends to listen to the chattering class and not open their eyes and take a look around this, drive around this district. I mean, I drive around this district every single day, hours and hours, and people do not support single-party Democrat rule. They don't support Joe Biden. They do support Donald Trump, and I'm proud to support him and proud to stand up for our conservative ideals, supporting the Constitution, supporting the Second Amendment, never voting to raise taxes, fighting to lower taxes, reducing regulations, expanding American freedom, supporting parents when it comes to their right to stand up for their kids' education. That's why we have the Parents' Bill of Rights. Standing for strong national security and peace through strength, and against defense cuts, which Joe Biden, when he was vice president, was one of the chief architects of major defense cuts. So those are policy positions that are, historically part of the conservative movement, but I'm glad that President Trump has expanded the Republican Party and grown, not just in rural areas like this district, but among Hispanic voters, among African American voters. That's going to be the headline from this election cycle, I believe, is that Hispanic and African American voters are increasingly looking to the Republican Party.
Is there anything that we haven't asked you about today that you would like to expound upon?
No,
Anything more?
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the substantive questions, and I really appreciate all the local journalism you do on local issues of importance to the readership.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.